So in today's talk, I'd like to focus on um, explaining why, from my perspective, it's important for us to look at the seeking and start to look at life from two different perspectives that can eventually become one integrated perspective. Um, and in order for there to be what I would call an integrated perspective, we first need to understand the two perspectives separately. And once there is a good understanding of the two perspectives individually or on their own, then they can come together and be seen as complementary. And these two different perspectives are what we can call different methodologies of teachings, teachings that are approaching the topic of liberation, coming to know yourself, or what equates to, in practical terms, happiness through peace of mind, a continuous, unbroken peace of mind, which turns out to be human happiness. So these are two different approaches, two different methodologies approaching this topic. And in fact, it's not so much that they are different and necessarily can work independent of each other, because the point of this talk is to show how a seeker, if they find themselves understanding both perspectives and investigating, inquiring into life from the two perspectives, that they will explain and make changes in their own relevant ways. And in some cases, there are changes that the other approach just isn't particularly tailored towards bringing about. And the same in the vice versa way, is that the other approach will make changes that the alternate approach just isn't equipped or isn't focusing on. And so from this point of view, you say, well, they're not just two different methodologies, which you can find yourself choosing one or the other, and either one doing the job. What I'm suggesting here is that they're both needed. And so that's why this is a talk about the integration of what we can call the top-down teachings and the bottom-up teachings. So a top-down teaching refers to a teaching that points out that which we are in essence, points out and describes life from a perspective that is not within time and causality. And therefore the descriptions of life are not particularly practical daily living type descriptions. They are bigger picture, transcendent descriptions. And that can also be referred to as awareness teachings or awakening teachings, because they're talking about the side of life, the aspect of oneself that we're not particularly familiar with. And by describing that, it is a pointing to that. And the descriptions, as they are understood, as they bring about change in the system, may reveal a recognition of that aspect of oneself, that aspect of life that previously was not seen. And in the moment when there is an experiential knowing, seeing what is pointed at, and in that moment there is essentially a felt sense that life and oneself is fundamentally or qualitatively different to how we have always known life. And so there can be this sense that, oh, I haven't known myself until now. I haven't known life until now. And that is what we can refer to as awakening. It would be an awakening to an aspect of life or an aspect of oneself that we were previously oblivious to, an aspect that we had overlooked. Now, awakening, although impressive, profound, because it reveals life in a way that hasn't been felt and sensed, it reveals our identity or our sense of self in a way that hasn't been known. So it is impressive, it is surprising, it is profound. It feels very real compared to what we are very familiar with. It's different. It's, in a way, you could say less relative, because a large part of the awakening is being intimate with life, free of a lens of relative thinking. It's not necessarily completely free of relative functioning. In fact, I would say it isn't free of relative functioning, but it is free of a very significant form of relative functioning that falls away. And when life is known without that lens, which is a lens of relativeness, which makes life feel more relative, when that falls away and what is revealed is, we could say, less relative, it feels more absolute. And the more absolute something is, the more real it feels, the more true it feels, because relative by default implies subjectivity, and it implies change, it implies opinion, perspective. So subjectivity and change are significant words when we talk about the relative. And if a layer of subjectivity, if a layer of subjectivity falls away, then a layer of change falls away. And so what's left is something that feels less changing and less subjective. And that essentially reveals an essence that can't be experienced, can't be felt, can't be recognized when the relative movement is at play. So that's the top-down teachings are pointing at this essence that is essentially outside of the dimension of time and space and causality. It is that it's a perspective of life from a dimension that includes or encompasses time and space and causality. So it transcends time and space and causality. Now the bottom-up teachings start from a perspective of daily life, from a perspective of the human being as we know ourselves, and moves upwards. And the languaging is much more to do with causality and explaining life from a practical point of view, and focusing on the specific thought patterns that need to fall away in order for the human being to function in a way that we can say is much more in line with what we really are. Now, what we really are, I'm not just pointing to the to the consciousness or awareness that can be recognized and is being pointed at to by the top-down teachings. I'm saying if we're really going to function in a way that is more in line, at least think more in line with what we truly are, what I'm talking about is a integrated knowing of ourself, which includes the body and the mind, so the body, the thoughts, emotions, and knowing that the consciousness and the awareness are not separate from the body and mind, and as a package create the human being. So the human being is a multi-dimensional entity, and we tend to know ourselves to start off with as being pretty much a physical entity and an emotional entity. And that essentially is only knowing one significant aspect of the human being. The awakening teachings say, hey, you're missing the essence of yourself. You're missing that part of the human being that is timeless and is untouched by circumstance. You're underappreciating yourself. And so the integrated knowing of oneself is to know oneself as a human being and know ourselves as a human being as a multi-dimensional entity, both physical, emotional, and in particular knowing that the core of the human being is consciousness or awareness. Now, if we know ourselves as a human being and recognize the consciousness, the awareness, but certain beliefs are still ingrained, then what's going to happen is that regularly, from time to time, the circumstance is going to trigger those beliefs. And if those beliefs are beliefs of what I would refer to as the remnants of our misunderstanding of what a human is, then even if we know the consciousness aspect, even if we know the human being as being both body, emotion, and consciousness, and yet there are some beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, which is a belief that is not an accurate description of what this integrated human being is. So that means that the integrated human really doesn't need outcomes in order to be at peace, in order to be content. The integrated human being isn't separate from life and isn't the one in control of how they function and what the outcomes are. And so if we have beliefs in the system that still tell us that we need outcomes and that we are the doers and the others are the doers, even if we have awoken, if there has been an awakening to the consciousness that flows through us, these beliefs are going to be triggered, and what arises is uncomfortableness. So the awakening is not some magic antidote to the end of suffering. However, it is a very significant component, and so that's what this satsang is hoping to do, is to talk about how and in what way the two different approaches and essentially what we could call the awakening to the essence of oneself, which is more efficiently or more focused on through the top-down teachings, and the removal of the deeply ingrained false beliefs of who we are, which is more efficiently focused on through the practical, day-to-day, causal explanations. So if you just picked one of them, you would essentially be getting maybe 2/3 of the process in each of the approaches. And if we can bring them together, then each of them do 2/3. And when you put them together, it fills in the gap. So you get all bases covered by bringing the two approaches together. Now, what happens if the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome are focused on, and intellectually we can say, yes, I understand that in theory, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. I understand that I've been seeking happiness through outcomes for my whole life, and I get them, and experientially I see that the outcome satisfies for a day or a week or a month, but it doesn't deliver some magic ongoing satisfaction. It doesn't deliver continuous happiness for the rest of my life. Whereas prior to achieving the outcome, prior to getting the outcome that we are focusing on, we do think that that outcome will give us everlasting happiness. So we approach, our job promotion with the idea that once I get that, then everything will be okay for the rest of my life. That tends to be how we think about it. Only to get a rude awakening, we get it, we're excited, we go to our celebration party that we've got planned with our friends for our promotion. And then a week later, 2 weeks later, we're at work and we find ourselves feeling triggered by, life circumstance, feeling internally more or less the same as we did before. And maybe we can have a realization that, the promotion may well improve my life circumstance. It may improve my lifestyle, which is more pleasure. It has given me more financial pleasure. Let's say the promotion came with a bigger paycheck. So there's no denying the benefit on the pleasure scale. However, we can see it hasn't delivered a magical ongoing satisfaction with life, which is what we were probably hoping it would deliver. Thinking that once that comes, then I'm sure everything is going to feel unshakable. So we can understand what the concept is saying. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. We might even be able to cut off the thinking, find the thinking gets cut off because we have become reprogrammed, restructured through the concepts. And yet there might be this sense that I'm really not satisfied in the present moment. That something really, it doesn't feel like this is enough. And we keep hearing that the present moment, what we are at, what the human being is already fulfilled. And so the seeking may get cut off, and yet we find, but it doesn't really feel that fulfilling. And the reason that could be happening is that the seeker at that stage still knows themselves and life a particular way, and knows themselves that is limited by, in a way, the way we know life. And so if we know life as time and space and form and causality, and we assume that that is how life is because that's what's always presenting, then without realizing it, we might well be pigeonholed within the confines of a box. Our thinking is within the box, and that the thinking is not a conscious thinking, but a deeply ingrained relationship to life. And so that deeply ingrained relationship to life, basically, whenever we are aware of the world of form, so if we see the tree, we automatically, unconsciously, in an instant, know the tree is something that has existed for 20 years, for example, and grows a little bit each day. And so the tree has come from a seed, and then the seed has turned into a seedling, and it's got bigger and bigger. And so we look at the world of form with an unconscious assumption of its history and where it's come from. And in that, form is taken to be real and absolute. And that then is how we know life. If we know life that way, then we know ourselves as part of life, let's say, as a physical entity in life. And so we have to, in a way, we're limited as to how we can know ourselves, because we can't have a broader sense of ourself than our sense of life, especially if life contains us, is how we tend to know ourselves in life, that we are contained by life. We are an object moving around within this world of time and space. And so if we see life as time and space, then we can't know ourselves outside of that paradigm. And the aspect of the human being that is already complete, the aspect of the human being that is at peace, is content with just being, is an aspect of the human being that lies outside of that dimension of life. It lies outside the dimension of time, space, causality. And so to the extent that our view of life is pigeonholed by time, space, and causality, then we might be looking for this sense of self that is already at peace, is content with the present moment, and we're looking on this dimension in which that aspect of the human simply doesn't exist. Which is why a lot of frustration happens listening to the teachings, because the teachings, the top-down teachings, are pointing at this dimension outside of time, space, and causality, and it might not propel us out of that dimension. And so we keep listening to the descriptions and never really get a sense of what is being pointed at, because it simply isn't in the dimension that we are resting in, the dimension of knowing time and space as objectively real. And because it doesn't propel us out, which it can do, but if it doesn't have that effect, then, well, we remain frustrated, looking to understand what it's talking about, but essentially finding ourselves on the wrong dimension, or on the dimension that is not being spoken about. So how can we know this aspect of ourselves if we're pigeonholed and restricted to a dimension on which it doesn't exist? Or we might hear the pointers that say your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And then we stop seeking outcomes and we sit still. But there's a flatness, there's a sort of bored emptiness there. And we wonder, surely this can't be it. And then we get propelled back into seeking outcomes because it just is inherently unsatisfying. So we go back to what we figure is the solution, seeking outcomes out there. So the solution, if there's such a thing as a solution, what needs to happen is for the human being to become connected, or rather for us to drop into, to know, to become familiar with the aspect of the human being that exists outside of this dimension of time, space, and causality. And in order for that to happen, we need to start knowing life as different to time, space, and causality. And so that really is not something that I can just say, oh, well, we can put descriptions onto it, and the descriptions can help, but it probably requires some concerted repetition and looking and investigating and saying, how can it be that life is according to these descriptions? Like, what does it mean that form is not really form, for example, that the table is not real? What does it mean that life is an appearance in consciousness? What does it mean that time doesn't exist, that causality is not real? So we'll have a whole lot of these pointers that are given to us in teachings, and they just don't reconcile with our view of life. And so the investigation is something that needs to happen while you're sitting in your living room, or while you're out walking, or while you're driving the car, where there's a curiosity, like, what does it mean that there is nothing outside of now, that time doesn't exist, that space here and there doesn't exist, that even the space in the present moment is not really space as we know it. And a lot of this investigation will require us to really challenge our presuppositions about what life is. And those presuppositions have been ingrained based on how the experience of life has arisen and how we've experienced it for day after day after day, for months, years after years after years, 10, 20, 30, 60, 70 years more for some seekers. And if the pointers that get us to question the nature of reality penetrate through, then there can be a recognition, an opening up of this dimension, this aspect of the human being that simply wasn't known. And that's when the game, in a way, changes, because the experience in that moment is, of course, life, I am not the same as I knew myself. And so if we know ourselves a certain way, which really means that there's a certain structure in place, the body and the mind, with its ideas of life, its way of seeing life, its way of perceiving, that's all a structure, very unique structure. We could say there's commonality in the structure of the human being and how we perceive time and space and what have you. There's a commonality in that, but it's going to be uniquely different for everyone, but with, let's say, a commonality. And then we can find in some people even that commonality is not there, it's changed radically. So every human has a different structure, either radically different or different with a commonality to it. well, there's two commonalities. One that only sees life as form, time, space, and then there's all of the subtle uniquenesses of that group of people that see life on that basis. And then there's another commonality, which is, oh, I can see life as eternal, and that life is actually experience. That experience collapses in each moment, and perceptibly so in certain meditations, perceptibly so when we realize that in the dream state and in deep sleep, the waking state is not present. In the dream state, the waking state is replaced by the experience of the dream, and in deep sleep, both the waking state experience and the dream experience fall away. And so, where did it go in deep sleep? And that's when we might start to realize that if we look at a background, there's a background to all of the three states, the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state, and we say, okay, well, all of those exist in a background, and that there's experience in the waking state, there's experience in the dream state, and in the deep sleep state, there's no experience. So what that might show us is that, oh, I see, so this experience, which this one is the waking state, is an experience that falls away and is replaced by the dream state. And that falls away and is what we can then call deep sleep, where there is no waking state experience, no dream experience, and there is deep sleep. And so when the waking state happens, that is the re-emergence of experience. Now, when we take life to be form and time and space, it essentially, and unfolding according to causality, it essentially is related to as an objective reality. That which is always here. That which will be here when I die, let's say. That which is here when I'm in deep sleep. And so the view is, oh, I've just checked out and life remains here. But all we really know of life is our experience of it. And so if we can appreciate that all we know about the waking state is the experience of the waking state, and we assume that the experience of the waking state means there really is an objective, lamp and tree and other person, whereas becoming really present and objective about the experience, precise about the experience, we might realize, wow, well, actually the tree is a tree because there is the experience of the tree. Now, I don't know whether there really is a tree or not, but what I do know is my waking state experience includes all of these objects, and in deep sleep, that experience is no more. And if we're really honest, we say, well, I know the person in the waking state, it's part of the experience. The body is part of the experience. The physical sensations in the body, the thoughts are part of the experience. There is a capacity for us to know what we are thinking. There is an awareness of, so that thinking is an object in the waking state. The words are essentially part of the experience, the sound, the emotions, all of that creates a sense of a person in the in daily living. So the person is known as part of the waking state, the waking experience. In deep sleep, when we look at it, there is no presence of the person. So there's no presence of the kitchen or the bed or, one's children. And there's not even any presence of who we know ourselves as. Because the deep sleep is the absence of experience. Now, if we keep thinking about life as an objective reality and, I just went to sleep and then I come back and I'm aware of this objective world. And so deep sleep is just me checking, me being switched off, and the world stays here. So then when we are switched on and we wake up, we go, oh yeah, that's the objective world that I'm seeing. And so we go through life living with an understanding of life as the objective world that is separate from me and that I live in, which is a deeply, deeply intrinsic way of knowing life that has been set in place by the way that the life experience arises for us. It gives us this sense that the tree is objectively real and outside of me, the walls are objectively real and outside of me, the other people are objectively real and outside of me. And we very probably and possibly have no reason to question that for our whole lifetime. And I would say that a large proportion of the population would die never even having questioned whether life is actually different to how we know it by default. There will be people who would have played around with the philosophy for an hour here and there, or maybe even given it some thought that they can have a discussion about it. But very few people in life have entertained it sufficiently for an alternate to pop out such that it's like, oh, this is not necessarily just a theory. Life is different. Life is not as I knew it. And in the experience of life shifting such that it is qualitatively different, such that the framework of time and space no longer seem to be the framework, such that the world of form, like the tree that seemed like a objectively separate object made of wood, is no longer presenting itself that way, but rather presenting itself as an image within a field of consciousness. That's when there is a radical surprise at life being different, and where our sense of self also transforms to match the new paradigm in which life is presenting itself. So in that shift, what we know ourselves is different. And so the question of how do I get to this satisfaction of outside of seeking pleasure in the future, which may be a question that arises when we're seeking satisfaction in the future, and that doesn't deliver satisfaction. We have experienced that, and then we try stopping. We do stop. We say, I'm not going to play that game, so stop, and we stop. And there's just an inherent unsatisfying boredom So we say, how do I get to this place where I'm not bored by not seeking and just feel like everything is that life is fulfilling? And there isn't an answer that can give to the seeker that's finding themselves in that place, because it's about a structural change. And you can't tell the seeker, oh, you need to have this structural change, and expect the seeker to make the structural change. It just doesn't happen like that. But if life brings about the structural change, which is what I've just been describing, so if someone suddenly does see life differently, then we can assume that the structural change has happened, that the structure has changed. And in that moment, the question of how do I find this place where life is satisfying becomes redundant, because the satisfaction, the contentment, the lack of feeling like things need to be different is what's present. And we can laugh at the fact that it seemed so essential to be seeking things out there, because in that moment it's all so simple. It's like, why would I need to go anywhere when life is this? And in saying when life is this, we also know ourselves differently. When I am this, and I'm not necessarily saying when I am life, but when I know myself as this entity or this essence that is different to what I've known myself as. So the answer essentially is to connect to a part of oneself that is inherently okay with life. Now, that connecting to that part of oneself is not going to happen if certain bonds aren't broken, if certain ways of thinking aren't broken. And what often happens is that the ways of thinking that need to break are what is inadvertently utilized to try and find this place where the human being is at peace. When in fact, in order to find that place, those types of thinking, those bonds, those rigidities need to fall away. And so if we find ourselves inadvertently utilizing those forms of thinking to try and find the place where I'm at peace, what's happening is the very opposite of what we're hoping for. By utilizing that form of thinking, we are validating it, reaffirming it as true, and that form of thinking is validating and reinforcing the very structure that creates the discontent, that is the discontent. And so there really is a frustration then that happens, because there's every intent to dedicate one's life to this movement, and yet what is in place is a way of functioning that isn't loosening the bonds and is in fact strengthening them, which means we might find ourselves putting in a lot of effort and feeling frustrated. And if this is never spoken about, then we might find ourselves continually waking up and asserting or seeing life through a certain framework, seeing life through a certain lens, and not realizing that there is a fundamental obstacle in the assumptions we have about what life is. The fundamental assumption that life is made up of objective form outside of ourselves. If that is unquestioned, we can have every intention to see ourselves as not the doer, for example, or understand or intention of attachment to outcomes falling away. And because that might be 65% of the process, there's going to be a lot of change that happens. But if this piece is missing, then the real sensed peace that is available when the suffering stops, that might not set in. And similarly, let me say that if we take this other approach, or we find ourselves on this other approach, and life suddenly opens up in a way that it's known radically differently, there's a whole range of structures that are still in place. So some structures have fallen away because life now looks radically and feels radically different, and we know ourselves with more depth. We know ourselves as formless and timeless. But there's a whole range of other structures which haven't been dealt with through the explanations of life being very different to what we've known it as, especially if those explanations are focusing on the fallacy of causality, the fallacy of time, the fallacy of form, focusing on an appreciation of awareness and consciousness. Those pointers have the capacity to create certain change that can open up our sense of life. But there'll be a whole range of other parts of the structure that are not addressed by those pointers. So this is what I was saying originally, is if we just find ourselves on one side, then there's going to be a lot of change, but bits that aren't changed. And if we find ourselves working with a teaching that comes from the other side, there's going to be lots of change, but some bits missed. So what if we bring the two together and we say, they're both necessary inputs, and they're different phases of the seeking. So I would say that when I look back on my process started off with diving straight into, the esoteric nature of life. The teachings that I was being presented with were basically saying life is just not as it seems, and we are completely ignorant because we only know life a particular way. We are lost in illusion. We don't know ourselves, and what we really are is God. What we are is consciousness. What we are is brighter than the light of 1 billion suns, was one description that I remember reading. So the teachings I was reading were basically telling me that life is completely mystical, and that humans, and Roger has no idea about the true nature of life or the true nature of self. And I was compelled by that. There was something inside that says, yes, this is what I want to know, and this feels right, and I'm going to dedicate myself to this path. And the questioning of the reality of beliefs and concepts and what the concepts say about what life is, and questioning time and causality, being encouraged to let go of an identity of being a person, knowing oneself as awareness that can only be known outside of the realm of thinking. So there was about 3 or 4 years of Roger being ushered through an investigation of life, such that this very esoteric aspect, or the very esoteric dimension of life, started to reveal itself. So life was described as a creation, a story, a plan, a predetermined story unfolding. And so you can imagine that the human being that previously moved through life relating to life as relatively mundane starts to open up to the fact that life might not be mundane, and it might not be random that we're bumping into people the way we're bumping into people. It might not be random that we're going through certain events in life. And so that's that's quite something, to find one's assessment of life loosening up and opening up, such that the knowing of oneself then opens up. And that went on for, let's say, 4 years or thereabouts. And I really thought that the seeking was about transcending life, transcending daily life, becoming more and more nothing, knowing oneself as awareness and not the human, not the person, witnessing life from outside and knowing everything that was witnessed as illusion. And so that's where the process sort of took me and takes people to a point where this starts revealing itself, and and we tend to find ourselves going deeper and deeper into this emptiness, into this nothing. It's not really nothing, but it's knowing life as not materially, absolutely, objectively real. Knowing it as a subjective experience that is arising and is interdependent and coexisting with the consciousness that I am. So knowing that the lamp ceases to exist when consciousness ceases. That the lamp is completely interdependent on my being aware of it. So this implies the car that is theoretically out there actually doesn't exist. That the car requires my awareness in order for it to have an existence. And that the body is an object that is interdependent on awareness. So the body ceases to exist when awareness subsides, which is, let's say, what happens in deep sleep. So the whole world that we assume is real and objective ceases to exist in deep sleep. Now, I'm not putting forward this as a description that is the truth. All of that which I'm putting forward is a concept. All teachings are putting forward concepts. Whatever has been said in the past, whatever will be said in the future by myself and any other person in life, no matter how enlightened, is always a concept and not the truth. I would say the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So some of the statements that say the car has no independent existence outside of my awareness is relatively true, we can say. It is a reason why it's said, it's accurate. You can take it as truth for some part of the journey and explore it as if it's true. I wouldn't believe it as absolute truth. That's why the statement is in the teaching that says whatever is put forward is a concept and not the truth. That's not saying that someone else could say, well, I won't put forward any concepts, I'll put forward truth. Whatever they put forward saying it's truth is a concept also. Because a concept is never going to be, words are going to be limited. The way that the words are put together and what is conveyed at best is a description. And it's not ever going to be the thing itself. And what is said relative to a certain problem may not be valid or true relative to a different problem. So we can put forward a concept that says, this is the way life is, and that concept is being put forward because the seeker has a certain viewpoint, and so a concept is put forward to address that, whereas another seeker will have a different obstacle, let's say, a different belief system that needs to be addressed, and so we'll put forward a concept that is actually contradictory to the one we put forward to a different seeker. Now, you'd say, so which one of those is true? And so none of them are true, they're both concepts. And they're both accurate and useful relative to the task that they are being used against or used for. But as a universal truth, well, I am. Let's stick with everything's a concept. The only truth in the manifestation is I am. I am is outside of thought. What is life if you stop thinking of life as being time-bound and causal, and you stop thinking of life as being non-time-bound, non-causal and eternal? What are you if you stop knowing yourself or thinking about yourself as being a person and a body, and you stop thinking of yourself as being formless awareness? And what that's suggesting is, we tend to take a concept and identify ourselves with that concept and say, oh, that's what I am. And then we know ourselves essentially through the concept. And a teaching might say, no, you're not that. And then say, oh, you're this, which is really just a way of breaking the identification with this. And we might swing over to the other side and say, oh, yeah, that's right. I'm not the body. I'm formless awareness. And what are you if you drop both of those ideas? And that's really pointing to dropping out of the realm of thought, out of the realm of concept and belief. And it's not something that our structure, the human structure, and especially the cognitive process, is simply not habituated to dropping out of thinking. And when it finds, when our system changes sufficiently that stopping thinking at will almost, meaning the structure has changed, that there's an appreciation of this realm outside of thought. And that means we can be in mid-sentence in our head about thinking about a problem and where we need to go, and the thoughts stop. Thought stop arises, and we're willing in an instant to just stop. And it's not so much about a willingness of our thinking that says, yes, I think it's time for me to stop. It's an intuitive, spontaneous dropping of thinking, because in that moment there's a reminder, drop into what you are, which is outside of all of this thinking about what you need and who you are. It's just stop. And it isn't so much about the stopping of thinking in a way where we're holding our breath, essentially, like holding our thought, where you can't. It's a dropping into this dimension of ourself that needs to have opened up. Otherwise, we might go, stop. And we just drop back, sort of out of thinking, but not into this depth of the human being. And that's like you haven't found a new gear. You're just disengaged in a sense from the gear you know, but that can only last for a very short period of time, because you haven't set yourself onto a new platform. So the dropping into this other dimension is a place where we can stop the thinking, planning, arguing with someone in your head, feeling bad about, who you are and what people think about it. Stop. And in the stopping, because it is dropping into this other aspect of ourselves, what is there is a recognition of life as, that's right, I'd forgotten. Life is presence. I am presence. And I lose touch of myself as presence and life as presence. What does it mean, life as presence? It really means that there has been a shift where there is there has been a recognition that the whole moment of life, which is life, the present moment, the whole moment, which is all we know of life, life as it is now, a recognition that that is always an arising in presence, in consciousness, in awareness. And it's available whenever life is here. And it's really, it's so simple when the structure has changed such that that's its home. It's like, what's the big deal? Why is everyone so identified and so attached with outcomes and doership and whatever? And so it seems like it's like just stop. I don't know what the big deal is. It's so simple. Stop. It's like it's not like you have to. Someone says you have to run 100 meters from here to there. That's like, okay, all right, it's only 100 meters. I'll run it. Stop is like the absence of even having to take a step forward. It's like how can you mess that up? And yet, the truth when we really understand is that we're just not designed to stop. We're designed to be running forward when the structure is a certain way. And so when the structure changes, which is not something we do, then stopping or just being outside of thinking is our nature, because the structure has changed. And so it's so simple. And in fact, if that's happened and we don't remember or realize what has happened, we might go, I don't understand why it's so difficult. Why seeking seems to just keep going and going and going for someone. When we look at the approach that talks about life from practical daily living, and we say, suffering is when there is an attachment to outcomes or the belief that I'm the doer. And then some explanations are put forward. You're not the doer because whatever is happening through you is the functioning of a very complex body-mind organism. And so once the descriptions are put forward, it's like, you're not in control of the future. You weren't in control of the past. So what's the point of, you say everything's happening according to God's will or life's will? So why... It can be confusing to someone as to why, when life is so clearly that the doership keeps going. It's like, I don't get it. It's like, isn't it obvious that we're not in control of how life unfolds? And so it can seem strange as to why this functioning that includes, suffering, can seem strange why it keeps happening when it seems so simple. It's only simple, and once the change happens, that then makes it our nature. If the structure is such that it's not our nature, then it's like, oh, of course, how can you expect what is simple for one structure to be simple for another structure? In fact, it's impossible. That's why it's, someone says, oh, it's very simple in theory, but it's very difficult to put into practice. And it's more than difficult, it's impossible. And yet the structure changes and we'll say, oh, it's so simple. Because the structure is different. So all of the concepts that are normally put forward in the teaching that say really what we're looking for is happiness. Happiness for the human being. And happiness for the human being is happiness through peace of mind, meaning not a happiness that we'll find in the future because we're doing things. It's just about being in the present moment, let's not even say in the present moment, being in life, knowing that life is what's here in front of you, doing whatever you need to do based on the circumstance that presents itself, and finding that the suffering, the craving for things in the future, the regret of things in the past, the complaining and the hating people and wanting life to be different, the anxiety, all of that's just not there. So that's happiness in daily living for the human being. And it is because the beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome have fallen away. However, they fall away when they are aided by and supported by this opening up of the dimension of the human being that we can rest in. And when we rest in it, we find, oh, I am at peace, without life needing to be different. And then the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes gets weakened by the fact that we might find ourselves lost in seeking for an outcome. Then we remember, I am, and we drop into this place and say, oh, I forgot for a while. My happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, which really means over here, when I drop into my being, I'm not happy because of an outcome. I'm happy because I'm here, because I am, because I'm connected. I know myself more fully. So this, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, is just a reminder that can pop up once we see ourselves completely invested in, a situation unfolding a certain way where we're convinced that if it goes our way, then I'll be happy. And engaging in it like that is inherently uncomfortable. We can feel, if we've become familiar with that type of thinking, we can feel I've lost myself while I'm projecting into the future, while I'm thinking this way. And so when we feel like we've lost ourselves, we just automatically, the thought is, I am, which reminds us to come back to the present. And it's like, here I am. So this is the preciousness here. The preciousness is here. And it's available all the time because here is life. And life is, whenever you're in life, here is available. Now, I know this is frustrating because the truth is that our structure may not be such that this dimension, this part of the human being is accessible. Why is it not accessible? Maybe it's because we're just still looking at life every time we wake up and every time we go through the shopping center and the garden and work. We're looking at life assuming it is one way, assuming it is the way that we've cognized it, or based on how we've cognized life. And it's been locked in that says, trees grow and they have a history, and all of life has a history, meaning, I used to be 5 years old. What if life can be seen differently to that? What if you never were 5 years old? What if all that exists is this right now? So I'm 40... am I already? Or coming up to? Good. I'm not 47 yet. It's my 47th year. So what if, am I 47? Was I ever 5 or 10? Maybe, yes. I don't deny that as the way I live life, but I also integrated in is the perspective of being able to say, really, all I know is I am now. I may have a photo of a birthday party, my birthday party, I do, with a blue safari suit on and a big jelly stain on it. I remember the jelly fell on me, and I wasn't happy that this jelly fell on my blue safari suit. And so I have this memory in the present moment. I don't know that ever happened. Life's mysterious. Maybe this is just all an illusion. And this memory is inserted in the present moment to create the impression that I was once 5. And just like a night dream at night that spontaneously appears, and then the character says, I'm 46 or 47, and no, 46. And I remember when I was 5, jelly, and this character has just appeared in the dream, this moment. The dream has just appeared, and he's talking about when he was 5. He was never 5. He wasn't even 2 seconds ago. But in the dream, once the dream world arises and the dream character arises, there are these memories, and the character feels them as being a representation of the past. in our world, maybe they are a representation of the past. Maybe that's why I remember being having jelly on my shirt, and why there's a photo of the jelly-stained shirt in a photo album somewhere. But I don't really know. I live as if I was 5, and at the same time, whenever I drop into beingness or into the present moment to know the deeper dimension of myself, that deeper dimension of myself is available when I'm not interested whether I was 5 or I wasn't 5, or what happened yesterday. It's just a dropping into here now. And in order to drop into here now, life has to be questioned, and we do have to realize that I assume a whole lot of things about life that may not be true. And at least in realizing they may not be true, we don't need to say they're not true. What we can say is that a memory of me being 5 is here as a thought. It may or may not be a representation of something that happened in the past. That's accurate. It may or may not be a representation of... If I say it is a memory, and because it's just a memory, which I can't prove to be what actually happened in the past, then that didn't happen in the past. That's going too far. So investigating the present moment, investigating thoughts and seeing the difference, especially memory. Memory is a good one because it creates this sense of time. Seeing what effect a thought... If I say to someone, I say, look, you're really hopeless. You know, that received by someone can shut them down and create a feeling that is radically different from before I said that. And so there's an opportunity for, in the investigation of the present moment, to see the power of feelings that arise. A feeling can arise and make us feel insignificant, worthless. Why? Because someone said I'm no good. So we can see the power of belief, because that feeling is essentially believing that what they're saying is true. We can be convinced that we've interpreted something correctly, and then we find out that we have misinterpreted what was being asked, or misinterpreted the situation. And we can see how convincing a thought is about, yes, I've interpreted it correct. And only when we find out in hindsight afterwards, we see how relative that thought is and how it can create, how it can affect the present moment experience. And what is aware of the present moment experience? What is aware of the thoughts, the feelings, the objects? Does that change, or does all the content change? So what I'm talking about mostly today is about this sort of knowing life differently. And as if we know life differently, it's like we come to know ourselves differently, because what is aware of the present moment is not the body from this perspective. What is aware of the present moment is the awareness in which the body is just an object, just like the chair or the other person. And the seeing of the present moment, we might get told, doesn't happen through the eyes or the ears. It feels like it does when we're convinced what we are is the body. The pointers will say you are not the body. The body is just an object. And for as long as you have confused the object as the subject, then the real subject can't be known. What you are is formless awareness. What is aware of all of the objects is not the body, but the awareness. So those pointers are pointing to knowing oneself differently. And at some point, all of that needs to be integrated back into daily living, where we say, well, actually, the truth is, in practice, you're going to live as a human being. The body is still here. And not only are you going to live as a human being, live as a human being as if the world is being seen through the eyes and through the ears. Now that might seem like, hey, you're going back to your old way and you're forgetting all of this stuff, all of these pointers that created this shift, if the shift happened. And in fact, it's not. This is the integrating. This is what is beyond that awakening. You're not meant to live, as far as I've seen in the process, as formless awareness, or as pure consciousness, but rather an awakening to that which coincides with an awakening to life being different, to the nature of life, which is experience, not being as mundane as we have known it when we've perceived it from the perspective of objectivity and seen it all as form and time and space. So open up and then bring it back in, which is where the concepts of non-doership become very important. It's you are a person. You have to live your life as a person, doing in each moment exactly what you're destined to do, dealing with a circumstance as it presents itself. Someone knocks on the door, and most likely opening the door will happen. The phone rings, and answering the phone will happen. Hunger arises, and cooking food will happen. So we have to live as if we're the person, knowing that the person is being lived, knowing that the person doesn't include some separate entity that is controlling what the person does. The person doesn't include this imaginary me doer, and the person's happiness, the person's contentness isn't to be found by achieving outcomes in the future, isn't to be found because everyone loves you, isn't to be found because everyone is being nice to you or because life is pleasure, 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 pleasure. Now, that becomes something that is available to know experientially when the dimension of the person that I've been speaking about mostly today opens up. And so then we can start, oh, I see. So the real problem is, one, not knowing, not having access to this dimension, and secondly, functioning as a person, even if we do have access to this person, believing I'm the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. That's the problem. That's what creates the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, the anxiety. And so we do need to come back down to earth, because if we remain witnessing, knowing ourselves as formless awareness, then this doership and this attachment to outcomes seems like it's irrelevant. We might have found ourselves aware of ourselves on this other dimension because we've been encouraged to stop thinking, to stop labeling, and that's very valid as part of the stop knowing life the way you think it is, because it's not that way. So stop thinking, because all of your thinking is reinforcing your old paradigm of life. It's keeping one in the dimension of time and tomorrow and happiness in the future and hating the other and blaming oneself and all of that. And so it's stop. Don't label anything. And if we find ourselves not labeling as a practice for a period of time, that's when we might start to realize, well, life is, the experience of life is here, and if I don't label it, I might be actually breaking some of these bonds that are keeping the perception of life one way. So let's see if there's a couple of questions. Hi, Inga. Hello, Inga.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Hello? Okay. Thank you so much, Roger, for your work. And I listen to you every day. It's like my therapy. I have, my life has, like many of the participants have told you, my life has changed a lot. It has given me a lot of peace, and I think the structural change in me is changing and deepening. And just yesterday, you said that the repetition, and that you don't mind and you enjoy the repetition, and that was exactly what I was thinking the other day. How much repetition do I need for this to stick? And because every so often, what life throws at me, I just, it's just like I've never heard of this concept. So today, everything you have said, I put my hand up at the beginning. I came in 20 minutes late. And then as you kept exposing the satsang for today, it kept answering everything that I'm going through right now. And I said, well, I'm going to take my hand down. But then, and then you said, all right, let's see if there are any questions. And here I am. So I'm going to try to articulate as much as I can for what I'm going through right now. I feel that I have integrated the two teachings in my life, top down and bottom up, and it has done to me miraculously best, if you want to call it therapy, or best. My suffering has stopped. And I'm in a situation. I'm in a good marriage. My children are doing well. My grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren, and every so often there are little problems. Then I remind myself that they're not the doers. Nobody to blame. Everybody's right. I don't get involved with their stories. This is for my personal life, which is the most difficult psychologically, and for my working life and everybody else, my extended family, even with my husband's children, which they're not always nice to me. We've been married 30 years, but they're still like resentful that their father got married after he was alone and not married, and divorced for 25 years. There's still his daughters are resentful. So even though which has been hard, I still see them as they're not the doer. They are who they are, and that's what life gave me in exchange for a wonderful husband. So I can do that. I mean, I am saying I can do that. This is being done in my life.
Mm-hmm.
The situation that I have right now is that I've been divorced for almost 30 years. And the father of my children, he's been out of the picture, and every so often he comes and he wants to be the father, and he brags about his family that he never contributes to. My daughter was 6, my other one was 9, and he took off, and he never paid child support or nothing. So now he just came yesterday, and I have all this resentment in me. I could not sleep last night, and I tell myself, oh, I thought that I can do that. He's not the doer. He was in my life for a reason, which I have done with him, because he's come here many times, and I have seen him as the father of my children, my daughters. If I didn't have this daughter, I didn't meet him, I wouldn't have his daughters, and I love my daughters. And
Mm-hmm.
but he creates this emotionally drama between my daughters and him and my son. And I try not to stay involved in the story, but I get hooked and I get involved in the story, and I cannot stop myself. And I said, like you say, stop. But it is like, like a child that has a ball, like my 2-year-old grandson that doesn't want to give it away. I hold it. And I said, well, after all, Roger, he's young. He's my son's age, 47 years old. I don't know if he's ever been married, divorced, if he has children. I don't know how much he knows about suffering. I don't want to make my suffering, and I'm in this state. I don't want to make it like, because I know from my work, where I work, I've seen in the courts, my suffering does not compare to many other people. But in my life, since I was born, I have suffering, because my mother didn't want to have children. She told us that she wanted to abort us, and she felt bad for to abort. And in her time, abortion was not that readily available. And she was enraged all her life at herself, at whoever was around. So we were put in a boarding schools, in fancy, wealthy boarding schools, where it was institutional. So when I got out of there at 18, I just did. I didn't want to see my mother or my father, so I just did. I married a Muslim, and I had a son, and it was a lot of suffering, a lot of pain. Then I got divorced, and I married this Scotsman that also there was a lot of conflict, and pain. And I always knew all along this, first because of the religion, that I could go down to myself, and I am, and here I am, and where there is, I'm formless awareness, but it didn't come like in a structure until I start reading and going into retreats from the top down teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they're great for meditation. I do some meditation, and they're absolutely wonderful. Then when it comes to the real life, then the first time I heard you, I was still trying to find myself with this absolute esoteric part of me. The first time I heard you, I think I told you, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. But then I heard you again, like about a year ago. And then I said to myself, yes, this is it. Yes, 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 yes. And this has, you have helped me enormously. But now when and it's been going smooth, but now it's not that I'm discouraged, but I just don't know if I should say now that this pain, I know like the the top down teachings, they say embrace your pain, just feel it, just feel it and accept it, and say, yes, my resentment, it's okay, welcome it, it's all right. And I've done this, with all my traumatic past, with my parents, and religion and Catholic religion and everything. But I don't know if this teaching, you're teaching, if this is part of what life is bringing to me now, right now. And I have to say, yes, okay, all right. I shouldn't feel bad about it. I shouldn't feel I'm regressing, and I shouldn't feel that what's wrong with me because I've been doing so well, or and it doesn't work right now. When I say stop, and he's not a doer, he's not, he is who he is, this man. Uh, and then I have to see him today because my grandson is having a party. He came here for the party. So it's just, excuse me, sorry. So it's just I don't know. It really makes me feel like I'm not I'm not what I think I am. That and again is the doership, and it's me, the I, and
So I have some input for you.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Sorry, I thought.
It's good to explain it and get it out. There's a time when those bits that haven't been released yet, the doership and the attachment that we might not have been aware of, but it's in the system and it's influencing our overall attitude to life, but in a way that maybe wasn't so noticeable until this situation came in. And now this situation has
No,
come
it's
in.
been noticeable. It's been noticeable every time, and I've been doing better. I have done better, but this time it's always noticeable.
Yeah, so this time it might be dragging out much more of what was always still left. And maybe it's because it's time for this to be the time it gets really let go of. And we don't want to use concepts to be unnatural. The whole point of the description is life is living us. If suffering arises, it's not your doing. And if we come in and we're saying it shouldn't arise, I should be better, I've been seeking for so long, in a way that is a resistance. And so if we see that that's happening, that it's very valid to let what wants to come up, what is being pulled up by life, come up, without trying to insist that the system doesn't have this hatred, let's say, this resentment, because that insistence can, although it's very useful, there's a certain phase, or not phase, but a certain movement in the seeking. There's three movements in the seeking. One of them is inquiry, and looking at the doership in the feelings and the thoughts and seeing, yes, this is doership where I see him as the doer. And so there's that inquiry. The other is dropping into being and and there's no inquiry and there's no suffering, or if the suffering is there, it is just witnessed. So those are two different movements. One, inquiry, active inquiry. The other is dropping into being. And the third is neither of the first two. And it's essentially a surrender to the suffering energy. Because the suffering energy is saying to you, I want to take you over. I want to have space. I want to express myself. It's like a volcano. It's down there, and
Yes.
so the suggestion here is there's a certain time in the process where your system is ready for that energy to come through and be processed in a way that may actually be the releasing of deeply ingrained doership and attachment to outcome. So the energy feels like it will kill you, that resentment. Most suffering, really, when it's intense, says, this is going to kill me. This is not good for me.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like, because it's a deep uncomfortableness with oneself and with the other. The truth is, it's a feeling.
Yes.
It will never kill anyone. So if you can, if it's possible, if your system is not too shocked by it, because if it feels when it feels uncomfortable, normally the system pushes it down. Maybe you can find a different movement happen which doesn't push it down. So get really angry, let out the words, not necessarily in front of people or to him. You can do it in private, which means be completely unenlightened, right? The energy that's going to come out is completely blame-filled, completely full of resentment, all doership and attachment. And who cares? This is a specific movement of the process that actually requires the other processes, the witnessing and the inquiry, to not be active. Because if they are active, they're getting in the way of this process. And so that's why it's important to hear that there are three main movements of the spiritual seeking that are all valid, and they're all different, and they're all good for different purposes. So this is sort of equivalent to embrace the suffering. But embrace the suffering almost means welcome it, hug it, be its friend. That's usually said that way because our tendency is to resist it, to run away from it, to be angry with it. And the actual, what is really meant is, don't push it away and don't embrace it. Because embracing it is also not authentic. Pushing it away is not authentic, and pretending that you like it or that it's okay is not authentic. Embrace it in its neutral sense means I surrender to the volcanic eruption. And your seeing of life from the perspective of non-doership and non-attachment that has been set in place over the last, 5 years of your seeking, that's still in your system. And when that energy comes up, it will be witnessing it for what it is. And the fact that there is this other understanding in your system doesn't mean you won't feel the doership and the attachment. You will, because it will be in that energy, but it means that the system will understand it's not personal. It will understand this is the attitude from the past towards this person that has been locked away in the system, and now it's time for that attitude from the past to get its time in the sun, because in the past it felt so uncomfortable it was suppressed. So hopefully these words might become part of that movement next time the resentment comes up.
Thank you very much, Roger. I see that, and I do that inquiry, and I ask myself, who's angry, who's upset, or who's resentful. There's nobody. There's my formless awareness can never be resentful or hurt.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very difficult because I want to go back to the story, what he did to me, and
But that's what I'm suggesting is really allow that story to have its space. Don't do the inquiry. I'm not suggesting to do inquiry. In fact, if you're asking this question, who is there to be angry, you're getting in the way of the anger, because in a way you're trying to diffuse the anger and the resentment. I'm saying the opposite. Be completely angry.
Good to be angry.
Yeah.
Because then
better in
because
that. Better out than in. It's
well. Who am I going to express the anger to?
Your pillow.
Well, I tend to, like my daughter is angry or too, my son is angry. So when they call me and they're angry at their father for whatever, then I get into their story, and then it creates, with my anger and their anger, it creates a whole huge volcano. So that's why I try to stay away from this anger. But yeah, I am angry, yes.
So that's what I'm saying. Maybe there's a time to be authentic, instead of saying, I shouldn't get angry, because the truth is we don't know. Maybe what I'm suggesting is getting angry, which means really allowing the anger to come out authentically, like saying, I'm not going to pretend. I'm going to be angry. Be the angriest out of all of your children and yourself. Be the one that is the most angry. And let go of how things should be or what you think is the best way. See, now I'm also not necessarily suggesting to do this in the middle of, a party. It might happen that way, and if it happens, that's destiny, it's God's will. Hopefully you can laugh at it at some point. But it might be too hard, to in a party, the pressure of all the other people.
Yes.
Really, what I'm suggesting is, if you feel overwhelmed, try and find a place where you are private, a room, and just get angry, and witness, actually feel how intense the energy is, because this is what's impressive about these repressed doership and attachment to outcome. The energy is so intense that we don't realize how intense it is until it is allowed to come up in its without us getting in the way, without us saying, oh no, we're afraid of it. It's so intense. We're afraid of what is there. So if you keep this inside, you can imagine it's not benign, when it's inside, it's so intense that it has an effect on our way of experiencing life. Maybe it might not be noticeable, but it's got an effect. So that's why I say it's better out than in.
So I'm going to try to be angry at the pillow, or at the angry, and feel it, and don't express it to my children, because when I have in the past, they have gotten angry at me too, and then it this whole thing has escalated a lot. But I guess it has helped us to to be that, to have the closeness we have now. But I'm going to try to be angry then. Yes.
Yeah, but
Thank you very much, Roger.
you're welcome. But don't try too
What?
hard to be angry, because then there's the doer trying to be angry. You're fortunate at the moment is the anger is just below the surface, right? So you don't need to.
Yes.
You don't need to try. Just when it's knocking on the door saying, "I want to come out,"
Yeah.
just don't get in its
Right.
way, right? Let it come out.
So that's not getting involved in the story?
Well, the story will be very intense. Like, I hate you for what you did. Really, that's what will be here.
Yes.
Get out of my life. Who says you have the right to come in?
Yes.
I don't want you to see the children. I don't want you to have any of the pleasure you didn't contribute.
Yes.
Just all of that.
Yes.
Let it come out, however it comes out, and you will witness.
Yes.
It's almost like you have your telephone recording all of the words, and you don't need to think about the words. They will form based on what the energy itself is, and there'll be a part of you that is registering this, and it might be going, "Wow, look at the intensity of that." But yeah, not taking it personally, because really all that anger is the ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, which is the old way of seeing life. So 25 years ago, this is how you saw life. It was very painful. It was taken personally, and it's still taken personally on this level. So what's going to come out is you taking life very personally, and that's not a problem. That's the release of the doership and attachment to outcome.
Yes.
So good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you for everything, the satsangs and your generosity, and you're such a blessing in my life. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.